Hi, guys, and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. I'm here with my co host, Amy Hollenkamp, RD.
Hello,
Hello,
everybody.
hello. And I am Nikki Danessa, and we are here to talk all things IBS. And in this episode, we're going to zoom in on SIBO root causes. Dun, dun, dun. Amy, care to start us off?
Sure.
Let's talk
I
about it.
think with SIBO root causes, first off, and I remember this from personal experience, when you originally get diagnosed with SIBO, you think that that is your root cause.
Totally.
That's a huge misconception and something that's really easy to fall into because you've had these issues for a while and you might have your GI doc or some other practitioner being like, this is it, like this is the problem, we just need to take care of this and then you'll
Mm-hmm.
be good. And I feel that that's very simplistic. Yes, SIBO definitely drives symptoms, makes things worse, but it's so critical to dig deeper as to what's driving the dysfunction, what's creating the SIBO.
Yeah,
SIBO develops because there's the environment in the gut has to be right for SIBO to develop. We have a lot
correct.
of mechanisms internally to prevent SIBO. So, really, when it comes to figuring out your root causes to SIBO, it's all about trying to determine what breakdowns are happening within the environment of the small intestines that is leading to an overgrowth.
Yeah.
And we'll definitely deep dive into I shouldn't necessarily say deep dive, but we'll touch on each of these pieces and
Yeah.
probably deep dive in more detail as the podcast goes on.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like, SIBO, I think I would say that SIBO is presented as the answer. And I think
Mm-hmm.
SIBO can be the answer to why you've had X, Y, and Z for so long, but it's not a root cause in the sense that, like, on some random Tuesday in 2014, your intestines didn't just say, it would be great, too many bacteria in the small bowel. Let's do that. Let's make it happen. Like you said, some protective mechanism, some check and balance system had to fall by the wayside or not do a good enough job that then things started to get weird and now you're off to the races and you have SIBO. So it's not like it just happens for no reason. And trying to understand
Yeah.
those reasons for the individual can be really critical to make sure that you don't relapse and make sure that you actually treat the dang thing in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. No, totally. I think that it's an area that gets a little complex. It's not usually a very clean box as to what your root cause is. Usually there's multiple things interacting.
Mm-hmm.
So usually there's root causes, not just like one root cause. So it's not necessarily like super linear. It's a little bit messy coming up with your root causes. And I think that's why a lot of practitioners don't really go down that rabbit hole or just don't really approach it. It's because it does get complex and it's hard to maneuver. But from my standpoint, it's where you're going to get the most long term progress, is if you can drill down,
Yeah.
really understand your root causes, and address them in a thorough manner. Um, and that way you're getting out of the very vicious cycle of like, well, I'm going to clear this SIBO and then it comes back and then you keep clearing it. You just get in this
Bingo.
chronic vicious cycle if root causes aren't addressed. And just a really frustrating place to be, I think, both personally and just seeing it working with clients, feeling very frustrated with just that model because there's really no way out unless you address your root causes.
Yeah. And I would argue, I think that you and I probably work with people exclusively who don't quite have a handle on the root causes of their SIBO. If it was
Mm-hmm.
and I'll kind of use this a little bit facetiously, but if somebody had a simple case of SIBO where, honest to God, the only thing going on with them is the overgrowth of the small intestine, those are the people who already went to the GI doctor. They got rifaximin. It cured them. And now they're like, woo, I can eat anything. And they like live their life. It's the
Yeah.
people who come to see us who are like, I've been on 8 gazillion rounds of rifaximin and it hasn't worked. Or I've done 8 gazillion rounds of berberine or neem, it hasn't worked. It keeps coming back. What do I do? And they've had it up to here, and then they find people like us, and we're probably one of the first, if not the first people, oftentimes to address the idea of, well, why did you get SIBO?
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting what you're saying too about those cases that are quick. And like, cases we don't see ever
Yeah.
are the cases where people, do treat and then they're fine. I would probably think still there was some sort of dysfunction that led to the overgrowth, and
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
that resolved. So like
Yeah.
maybe they had maybe they got diagnosed with Hashimoto's or something, or thyroid issues, treated that, and then found out they had SIBO and kind of cleared the SIBO and things went back to normal. Or, maybe they had a period of really high stress and that might have created
Yeah.
the SIBO, but then it resolved. Like, I
Yeah.
still think there's root causes there, but
Oh, yeah.
like they've probably resolved in order to have such high efficacy with the rifaximin.
Yeah. And I would argue the same. I think that, and it's important to acknowledge too, and this is kind of like a functional medicine point that I make with a lot of my patients. Oftentimes, when people talk about the root causes, so they're thinking, I was normal, quote unquote, and then one day I was not normal. And for some people, it's like, I got food poisoning, and ever since, my gut has been weird. Or
Yeah.
I had this round of antibiotics, and ever since, my gut has been weird. So oftentimes, when we talk about root causes in like the, internet blogger spheric realm, that is a root cause. Like the trigger, the thing that
Yeah.
actually dumped you over the edge into dysfunction, that is a root cause, but it's one flavor. You've got the triggering event that actually shoved you off the edge of the metaphorical cliff, but then there's also the things that like nudged you closer to the edge of the cliff to begin with. Or if you're
Yeah.
already dangling off of the edge of a metaphorical cliff and you're already in a dysfunctional state, it's going to make it much harder for you to progress and heal. So, like, those are the cases I see where people are like, but my stress didn't cause the SIBO, the whatever did. And I'm like, yeah, but if you're stressed up to here and your gut brain axis is fried, you're going to have a hard time healing and getting your tissues to work appropriately. So it might not be that stress caused the SIBO in the sense that stress isn't a trigger for the original SIBO, but it can keep you stuck in a rut and keep you from healing. And in that case, something like stress can be a root cause, even if you don't think it was the actual triggering event, right? Like there's kind of two
Yeah.
different types of root causes too.
No, you're 100% correct. I think I mean, I'm often working on people's cases where I'm like, "Oh, that's a big notable thing right
Yeah,
here," but like they're not paying attention to it as something that they think could have been a factor in their case. I kind of
yeah,
view it as a very perfect storm type
yeah,
scenario. So you get a perfect blend of maybe a lower fiber diet for a period of time, maybe some antibiotics mixed in, maybe, you have periods of stress blipping up, and then maybe again you have a food poisoning event that just kind of sets things off.
mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's always like a weird concoction of different things at play. It's not usually just this one clear cut thing, as you're saying. It's like this gradual buildup, and sometimes it's very subtle,
Yeah,
but some of the subtle things can be huge factors.
yeah. And that's kind of analogous for the human experience anyway. Like nothing happens in a vacuum. No
Yeah.
body part works all by itself. Like
What?
things I know, conventional medicine, hold your hats, like this is going to blow your mind. The
Yeah.
body works together. But I do think, it's worthwhile noting that like just because you didn't perceive those gradual steps towards that cliff of dysfunction, it doesn't mean you weren't still headed that direction. And there might have been periods where you were moving away from it and you were healing, but you are probably more likely to perceive that triggering event where you just went off the gutter and then off you go, and now you have whatever your diagnosis is. That's what we tend to be more consciously aware of, at least. But that's where working with somebody who has less of a biased opinion and can look at it from a lens of, just another pair of eyes, another pair of ears, another brain on the case can be helpful in dissecting that too.
For sure. Yeah, and I think there has to be a very clear mentality shift. Like what you were saying, we're probably the few or only practitioner that people work with that are asking, why did you get SIBO? So there has to be that shift of mentality. It can't be just like clearing and killing and then SIBO's gone. There has to be that ability to shift mindset and ability to dig deeper.
Yeah.
And again, some practitioners are probably better at it than others, and I think we're very sort of specialized, which makes it easier for us to do.
Yeah.
But you're totally right. That shift is really important.
Yeah. And even like before we hopped on this call, my patient that I just saw today, like I brought up that I'm suspicious of SIBO. We're going to order a breath test. And we talked about SIBO a bit. And then I went in the back to mix him up some herbal concoctions for his gut brain axis. And then came back and he was like, okay, I'm reading about SIBO, but like, what are the root causes? Like, we need to get to the root causes. And I was like, oh, sweetie, I love that you asked that, first of all. But B, whether you realize it or not, I already screened out a bunch of the known SIBO root causes in the paperwork that you filled out before today's appointment. And then we went through some of the ones that I thought were more relevant for him. So that's something that I ask every single patient because I want to know, like, do you have any of these things that will dump you over into SIBO land in and of itself? But if I and I don't know if we'll have the same opinion on this. It'll be curious to see.
Yeah.
What do you think the number one most common triggering event or triggering thing would be amongst the people that you've worked with? And then I will share, I don't know if I could give it a number one clearly, but I think number one and number two are pretty close as far as like the triggering event that people are consciously aware of and can go back and look back and go, oh yeah.
Yeah, I'll do you one better. I'll give you three because I feel like it's a little bit hard for me to do two because I feel like these three again are my top.
Okay.
I would say stressful events or stressful periods of time. Maybe they move, maybe they start a new job, maybe they're planning a wedding.
Yeah.
I see stress as being very heavily tied into gut function and a SIBO root cause. I would say food poisoning events, definitely up there in terms of triggering events. And then I'd also say antibiotics. So if they took a round of antibiotics, maybe they've had like chronic infections or something and they're kind of on them a lot. Maybe it's a one-off, but I do hear a lot of times where people were doing okay and then they took a round of antibiotics and it just was off ever since. So I'm curious to hear what your two were.
Yeah, and it's curious because one is the same and one is a different one that you didn't mention.
Okay.
It's interesting because the antibiotics SIBO link, I think, is now getting explored. I agree. I think I asked people, I have a part of my questionnaire where I ask, like, how many rounds of antibiotics did you have in your childhood, in your adulthood, like in the last, year or two? And I can tell you as a child of the 80s, I had like 87 humans worth of antibiotics in my lifetime. So I shudder to think of what that did to me. But I might not have put that so high on my list, just in part because it's so commonplace that people have so many antibiotics that maybe I'm losing sight of that and how profound that could be as far as SIBO goes. I would have identified, well, see, this is unfair. Now I have to have a third because you had a third.
Yeah,
go ahead. I would say stressful events also are in the top three that I've seen. Like, husband lost his job and the mom was overworked and they've got, a gaggle of children and they're putting strain on the relationship. And then I'm thinking of one case right now. And then the mom started developing what was later diagnosed as mild gastroparesis and
Mm-hmm.
SIBO. And it's like, that's the only thing in her case that makes sense is that
Yeah.
time frame. They're like, her husband didn't have a job and they were tight for cash. It was really stressful. So stressful times or stressful events are definitely in the top three. Food poisoning is a big biggie that I see quite frequently. And then also acid suppression, like whether it be a proton pump inhibitor or something like Zantac. Usually, this is more associated with the proton pump inhibitors more than anything else, but I think that mucking with the stomach acid barrier is a very big root cause for SIBO for a lot of people. And I've had some SIBO patients that we got rid of the SIBO. They were doing great. They were eating FODMAPs. They were happy as a clam. And then they had a little bit of reflux and they made the mistake of going on Zantac or Prilosec at the recommendation of their PCP or whoever. And then they relapsed. And then they're calling me again. And I'm like, why are you calling me? You were good for like two
Yeah.
years. And then it comes up, oh, and I took Nexium for 2 months.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, that'll get you. Now you're here. So the acid suppression, I think, is a big one that would round out my top three personally that I see.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah. For
go ahead, sorry.
for sure. No, I think anytime you're hindering digestion in any capacity, and with proton pump inhibitors and things that are lowering stomach acid, those are clearly going to affect digestion, which has a lot of downstream effects in the small intestines
Mm-hmm.
and just creates a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Um, and the hard thing about PPIs, which I think is like so awful, is there's no end in sight with them. Like they're so hard to get off of.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I was on PPIs at one point.
Mm.
I had like gastritis when I was 19.
Mm.
Um, and I specifically remember struggling to get off of them. And I was young. It's not like I was old, but what basically happens, like what people don't realize when they go on these PPIs is that their whole stomach shifts in major ways. Like the cells of your stomach basically increase in size
Mm.
to try to overcome the suppression of the stomach acid to help you digest. And then when you go off of them, you have these huge cells that then are
That,
pumping out a ton of acid.
yeah, they're
So
like acid producing powerhouses.
exactly. So the floodgates are open with this acid in it. Then you're like, well, shoot, like I'm super uncomfortable and now I'm feeling refluxy. I need this medication. So
Yeah.
the hardest, to quote Ursula from The Little Mermaid, the poor unfortunate souls that are on these PPIs, honestly, because they're just such a hard thing to get off of.
Yeah.
And but I agree to your point. If you ever want to optimize not only digestion but even nutrition,
Yeah.
like PPIs lower a
The
ton of
worst.
different nutrients.
They're the worst.
Yeah, they deplete so many nutrients. The stomach acid is super important to prevent pathogens as well. So, I mean, they're preventing pathogens. You need stomach acid to digest your food. I hate that that's like the first line of defense whenever you have any stomach issue by the conventional sphere is, try this PPI and see if it works.
They really get prescribed so willy-nilly and it drives me absolutely bonkers because they are prescribed in a way as though there's no repercussions or no ill
Exactly.
side effects. And it's the opposite. So many people get side effects. Meanwhile, freaking lactulose is a prescription in the United States, which drives me absolutely crazy. So that's like a whole other podcast episode in itself. But lactulose is so safe and well tolerated and effective for so much stuff that I would use it for. But it's a freaking prescription. But we just give out Nexium and omeprazole and Protonix
Yeah.
just like freaking candy at Halloween.
Yeah.
But rant over. So, for example, and this is not an ultra up to date book. I probably need to get another one that's more inclusive. But as an example, the
hmm
side effect Bible, or I have another one, the nutritional cost of drugs, right out here. Nutrients that are robbed from omeprazole, which is a PPI. Beta
hmm
carotene, folate, thiamine, B12, iron, sodium, zinc. I happen to know also I mean, iron, protein, magnesium. I'm
For
surprised those didn't
sure.
make the mix. Like all of those, you have a harder time with. So the hats are off when you're on a PPI. Not only are you going to have to deal with the fact that you're not digesting and absorbing your nutrients and your freaking food, the pH shift that happens local in the stomach and also in the intestines further downstream
Mm-hmm.
affects digestion and it affects the microbial communities there. You know, you have bacteria like H. pylori that can be normal inhabitants of the stomach for I think it's 70% of the population. But when that stomach acid is not there and the pH shifts and it's more alkaline, that's when H. pylori can get more rambunctious and it can cause you more problems and it can overgrow and candida potentially in the stomach, which I was surprised a couple of years ago to learn that's a thing. You're mucking with the
Well,
microbiome local to the stomach as well as downstream, and that it's really no wonder why so many people get SIBO from these drugs.
yeah, I mean, in the H. pylori thing blows my mind as well because H. pylori is going to go out of control when you do that PPI, and there's like, GI docs or even your GP might prescribe you a proton pump inhibitor without doing any thorough analysis that you might have H. pylori, which is just going to make the H. pylori issue way worse if you're taking the PPI. And to your point, too, I think I just want to bounce off your point about digestion downstream,
Mm-hmm.
which I think people miss the boat a little bit. Like they know, oh, stomach acid's off, and that's really important. But like we need food. It's called chyme. It's like the
Yeah,
mixture of food, stomach acid that's being digested in the stomach. Well, when it's ready to be spit out into the small intestines, it needs to be acidic enough to stimulate digestion in the small intestines.
exactly.
And if that digestion isn't up to speed and you don't have secretions like pancreatic enzymes, you don't have bile flow because
Mm-hmm.
that chyme wasn't acidic enough, you're going to get you're going to have a lot of problems downstream and you're
Yeah,
creating an environment for SIBO to overgrow.
totally. Yeah, and that's something I call it digestion dominoes.
Yeah,
And like
exactly.
I had a slide in my online course. I actually like took the moments to edit the picture and I like made what looked like a real board game. I amused myself way too much.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's like if you now there's other dominoes in place before stomach acid, which we'll talk about down the road.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you don't have stomach acid, you don't get that local reflex to stimulate the release of pancreatic juices and bile.
Yeah.
And you also don't get a lot of the MMC waves and the motility stuff,
Mhm.
let alone the shift in pH in the small intestine itself.
Yeah.
But you don't get that synchronicity and that like harmony, and you don't get that whole orchestrated chain of events, and it's like the dominoes stop falling and then the rest of the chain never falls.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty big deal, stomach acid.
It is. And I think that pH is something that's very fascinating in general because pH, which again, we kind of, I remember like science class with those little strips. Did
Yeah.
you ever have those little
Yep.
pH strips?
Oh yeah.
But pH is like super critical just from a microbial growth standpoint. Like certain microbes are going to grow at different pHs. So you
Yeah.
really want pH to be optimal and not
Mm-hmm.
off because even that could affect what's growing and not growing in the small intestines.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, and I think yeah, this is like a whole can of worms. We should honestly do a whole separate episode
We
about
should.
stomach acid and pH and the shifts,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll leave it, you know, this point, for example, this bullet point as it's a big freaking deal.
Mm-hmm.
These drugs are not without consequences. No matter how lackadaisically they are prescribed, they have a lot of consequences and they are a very common root cause of SIBO. Now, what's interesting, and I'll kind of get your opinion on this too. I don't know if you've observed this as well. Is it just me, or was it that up until 3, maybe 4 years ago, the research was very consistent on PPIs causing SIBO? like a startling amount of the time. I forget
Mm-hmm.
what it was, but somewhere around along the road, I was reading studies that said if you're on a PPI for more than like a month or two, there's a staggeringly high rate of SIBO already, let alone the
Yeah.
people who are on it for years. And it was pretty clear at that point that PPIs cause SIBO, cold, done, sealed deal. And then all of a sudden now, in the last 3, 4 years, I'm seeing a lot of studies that are coming out that are saying, nope, no association. You're all good in the hood, man. Keep taking your Nexium. And I am so freaking suspicious of this. And I swear to God, this is my theory. You can tell me if I'm off my rocker. I really think that it's because the people who make these drugs, whether it be, Pfizer or Bayer or whoever the company is, I think that there was enough popularity in the SIBO community. I think that was around the time when the first, online summit was happening. More clinicians are learning about SIBO, more people are learning about SIBO, more podcasts. I think as SIBO grew in its awareness and its popularity, and more of this information got out there, my guess is that fewer people were taking these drugs. And I think that the drug manufacturers probably funded some of these studies, if I had to guess, to say like, oh shoot, we're hurting in the pocketbook.
Yeah.
We're gonna publish a handful of studies that say nope, no correlation, you're good to go. I find it really suspicious that the research was so consistent up
Yeah.
until kind of the peak of SIBO, and now they're all saying, no, bro, you're good. I find it very weird.
Yeah, I do too. And I remember too, like there were even meta-analysis. So like a
Yeah,
conglomerate of different studies coming together.
multiple studies.
Yeah, and proving that um, they do have a high correlation and are potentially a causative agent of SIBO. But then I remember specifically too where I started seeing that shift, and I had never thought about that. But it makes sense to me. I
It's all
think,
the money. I
yeah,
swear to God.
it's crazy how much control the pharmaceutical companies can have on studies.
Yeah,
Um, so it's always important to try to do or work with someone that's doing a broad look at the research and
yeah,
also just has a good understanding of physiology in general and
yeah,
how things work. Sometimes, again, studies, even on things we don't totally understand, if you understand physiology, you can sort of piece things together. Studies
yeah.
can certainly be helpful at proving hypotheses that you might have, but
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what we understand of the stomach, it doesn't really make sense that PPIs wouldn't affect things downstream in the small intestines.
Yeah,
Even regardless of the studies that do show correlation, I think just in general, what we know about the stomach, it doesn't make any sense that there wouldn't be any effect.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
kind of my
And
take.
I agree. I think it's important, and this is kind of a little miniature soapbox moment. I think it's important that, and this goes out to clinicians, it goes out to normal people too. Um, you and I, and we could all hop on PubMed all day, every day, and we can get lost in the weeds of reading this study and that study about this thing and this thing and this cell and this bacteria. But at the end of the day, what actually matters is what the human body responds to.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen, even ignoring, for example, like the research. I think that in this regard, like the research on PPIs and stomach acid suppression led me down a path to paying attention to this, right? It's not like every person who's on Nexium, I'm like, you have SIBO, automatically,
Yeah.
done, seal deal. But it's like, it's alerted me to keep my eye out for that. And
Yeah.
what I've observed clinically over the years is that those people, especially people who have had months or years of being on these drugs, they do very consistently have SIBO. And getting their stomach acid functioning again, or getting, working with the reflux and working on getting them off of those drugs and bolstering their stomach acid and getting those digestive juices logged online is a very critical part of the process of working with SIBO. And I also have seen patients relapse when they take another PPI or Zantac or whatever. Or even, I think, even if you use Tums more than occasionally, I think even something like that could be problematic. Like I know one patient I can think of, she had a lot going on, so there was a lot to unpack. But one of the things that came up was her, I think, primary care had recommended that she chew on 2 Tums every day for a calcium supplement.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, this is horrible advice. Please
Yeah.
stop. So I had her start on some other supplements, and I had her start on some oat straw and doing some nutritional things. Like we're trying to get calcium in other ways because she can't do dairy like me. We got other sources of calcium on board so we could get her off the freaking Tums,
Yeah.
and her IBS got way better. And she was on those Tums, chewing on those Tums every day for a calcium supplement for years by the time she got to me. So even something like that, it's not going to be as heavy of a hitter as something like Prilosec or omeprazole or Protonix. But I do think that that's enough if you do it every day, that even something like Zantac or Tums could be problematic for this in a, similar vein.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking of 2 or 3 clients that did Tums at least daily, and I think it caused a huge problem in working off
My
Tums.
grandmother. I
Yeah,
look back at my grandma and I wish to
exactly.
God I could go back in time and tell her, A, I think my grandmother actually probably had celiac disease and none of us knew. And B, like the BS that the doctors told us caring for her as she got older, she was on Tums every single day as a calcium supplement for, I mean, probably decades.
Yeah.
And I look back and I'm like, I wish I could go back and tell her, like, or tell my mom and dad who took care of her, like, no, this is a bad idea. But they didn't know. You trust the authorities in your life, you trust the doctors, and you just run with what they tell you. Um, but anyway, I think that, getting off of these drugs in whatever capacity you can. Side note, neither of us are prescribers. I'm not a
Yeah.
prescriber, you're not a prescriber. So you need to work with your doctor or find somebody who can work with you on this. You could do the herbs and you could do strategies to get rid of the reflux and get to a point where you don't need the medication.
Yeah.
But better safe than sorry. Work with somebody who knows what they're doing on this. Don't just like willy-nilly stop taking your Protonics because we said so in a podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
But having a strategy in place to get off of those can be like earth-shatteringly important if you have IBS and SIBO. So I do think that's worth addressing.
Yeah.
Moving on. Now, this could be, again, a whole other podcast episode in and of itself, but let's touch base on one that we also both identified, which was stress. And that whole, I'll tell you, I don't remember if I told you this when we did our first episode about our stories. My gut was never worse than when I lived with my crazy ass roommate. I call her Crazy Carol to this day. Crazy Carol, if you're listening, my God.
Can we
I don't know what to say to you.
talk more about Crazy Carol and later? I want to kind of bring up
Sure.
Carol all the time.
Sure.
Crazy Carol.
Absolutely. And we could call all crazy people Crazy Carol from now on.
Yeah, kind of like Karen.
Yeah, exactly. She'll be our Karen. But like when we literally got in an argument about gluten, like you do.
Yeah.
And I had gone gluten-free and she thought that I believed that everybody on planet Earth needed to be gluten-free, and she got mad at me like a crazy person, yelled at me and said, Nikki, not everybody needs to be gluten-free. And she like slammed her door. I was like, well, that was weird. And we had friends over. We were having like a movie night. I was like, sorry guys, that was Trey awkward. I don't know what her problem is. And she slammed her door. And then I visited a friend for like the weekend, and I came back like Sunday night, and crazy ass Carol did not talk to me for a month and a half.
Oh my gosh.
And that little squirt of a 5'3" run, I'm 6 feet tall, so I could call her that, but she was stomping around in the apartment and slamming cupboards and slamming doors and being the most passive aggressive psychopath ever and not talking to us. And my poor third roommate, who thank God is like the most awesome human on the planet Earth, she kept me as sane as I was. But when Crazy Carol was at her craziest and not talking to me before Mamie and I moved out, I mean, I just like everything made me bloated. Everything made my intestines cramp to a point where I thought she was putting gluten in my food intentionally because that was the genesis of the fight. I thought she was like sprinkling flour in my food. But in actuality, I look back and I remember thinking my Like I could drink water and get bloated.
Yeah.
Literally, like anything I put in my body. And I look back and I'm like, well, yeah, because your gut brain axis was shot. You were stressed to begin with in graduate school, let alone when Crazy Carol had her snap moment and wasn't talking to you for a month and a half. And I look back at past Nikki and I'm like, oh, sweetie, take some ashwagandha or something or get out of that house.
Oh.
And, you know, I can speak from that very like obvious firsthand experience. There are stressors where in the moment you're like, I'm stressed. And then looking back, you're like, I was stressed. But then there's other ways that you could be stressed and potentially be pretty oblivious. And I've had moments like that too, where in the moment, I would have told you, no, I'm not stressed. And now looking back, I'm like, oh, I was crazy stressed.
Yeah.
And I was like bottling it up in like a tight ball and shoving it down. and that's the American way.
Yeah.
Is to just bottle it up and shove it down. And it's not serving anybody. But I do think a lot of us have some degree of gut-brain axis dysfunction or adrenal fatigue or dysfunction or just stress. And it affects every cell in your body.
Yeah, totally. I mean, for me, my gut issues definitely were on a negative trajectory due to stress for a long period of time prior to when my gut issues really kind of went overboard. And I would say a stressor that took my gut issues to the next level was starting a new job. That and it's a job in our company that I work. The company I worked for was like growing 20% each year. So like the growth at this company was insane. And it's like a tech, it's like kind of like a techie company that I worked at. But just the amount of work that was expected. And I was doing like a lot of high level projects for like board members and stuff. And I was like I had just graduated. So it was just crazy. And then I had to like, my boss didn't know all the projects I was working on and like couldn't help me prioritize. That was definitely like a huge straw that broke the camel's back in my particular case. I would say too, I tended to feel like I thrived when I was under stress, like just in general. I think too, I was under a lot of physical stress throughout my life and building up to this as well. Like my workouts were very endurance heavy and I don't think that helped my gut. I think sometimes we don't connect that there's physical stressors that play into everything. So definitely my workouts weren't helping my mental, emotional stress at work. And just working with clients, it's opened my eyes in a lot of ways on how, what you were saying, the American way of like bottling things up and shoving them down.
Yep.
We tend to value being stressed out. So it's really hard to unpack that. So I always try to look out for it. And I always try to make a point with the clients I work with too and say, you know, our goal is not to get rid of stress. You're always going to have some level of stress. And there's actually good stress too, and that can affect your physiology in a similar way as bad stress as well. But there's always going to be stressors. You might have a new job, you might have a new kid, you might have a new house, you might, you know, have a death in the family. Like there's always something, I feel like, going on. And it's about raising your tolerance to stress.
Yeah.
And I think that concept is really helpful because it's not like you have to, you know, cut out every relationship that's stressful or cut out everything that's stressful. You have to quit your job. Like some jobs you might need to quit if they're overly stressful, but most of the time you can sort of raise your tolerance to stress and it's not necessarily that the job's bad in any way. It's that your tolerance to stress is low. Your stress bucket is overflowing, and you can make that stress bucket bigger by doing certain strategies.
Absolutely.
And removing things that you can, but the goal is to not have no stress.
Yeah. I mean, I oftentimes joke with patients, and I told my patient that I just saw today about this, that I can't get rid of your stress. I wish I could,
Yeah.
unless if I told all of my patients to quit their job,
Yeah.
abandon their family, and move to the beach and just get like a beach house and lay around naked on the beach all day and catch like wild caught ocean fish and like grow organic produce and lay around and get vitamin D and like have sex on the beach all day. That's the ideal state of human physiology.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
would be the zero stress situation, assuming that like other people are cleaning your house and doing stuff for you. Shy of doing that, I don't think I can take away all stressors in your life. So it's not practical for me to attempt it. But if we can help your body tolerate it, so instead of having this like insane roller coaster that we're all used to, where it's like, oh, I'm having a good day. Oh my God, I'm stressed. I'm having a
Yeah.
good day. I'm stressed. Oh my God, I'm bottoming out. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. If you could do things in your life, like I'm a nerd for herbs. So things like eulithro, ashwagandha,
Mm.
ginseng, licorice, holy basil. I mean, the list goes on and on. Passion flower. So many of these herbs can take your roller coaster from this to this. So like
Yeah.
you're still going to have more stressful days and less stressful days, but at least you're not going to be like going nuts and scrambling as much and then bottoming out and being fatigued and then going nuts and like it makes the rat race much more tolerable and it can increase your tolerance and to your point make your bucket bigger. um, yeah,
Yeah. Well, and
that's my angle. And then things like meditation, having hobbies. I mean, I'm into painting right now, and it's like the best stress relief I think I've ever had in my entire life because I'm
nice.
painting all the time and I love it. So, it depends what you would get joy out of and what would help empty that bucket for you. But there's a lot of ways to pet a cat. So it's not like you have to take ashwagandha or you have to do meditation. They're both great, but pick the things that call to you.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. Meditation's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but you can find something that works. I will
Yeah.
say, on the stress side of things, um, with some of the physical stressors, so like things like poor sleep, maybe movement is too intense or not enough, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe circadian rhythms are out of balance. Like, I do think those things really anchor our stress response as well, which,
Mm-hmm.
like, tend to go unrecognized a lot of times when we think of stress as like, oh, I definitely need to do stress management, which is very important. I'm not saying it's not.
Totally.
But recognizing too that like lack of sleep is a stressor. Not getting sun is a stressor. Uh, and
Yeah. To your
just
point, not moving
yeah,
or overtraining,
exactly.
stressors,
Stressors.
eating
Um,
not enough calories,
stressor.
friggin' stressor.
I know. My gosh, that's such a big one, I think, in the SIBO space.
Yeah.
So I just think sometimes we view stress in a narrow lens when it should be seen in a broader lens. So I just wanted to make sure like people weren't
Yeah.
just focusing on like, oh, I feel like I'm good like mentally, emotionally, but then like their lifestyle habits are not great in terms of sleep,
Yeah.
movement, that sort of thing. You can always try to pull the levers of the physical stressors as well.
Yeah. And I think, you could think of it as all of these things will cause, you can think of it as inflammation or disruption of bodily processes, or you could just think of them as stressors. And there's physical stressors and emotional stressors or like psychological stressors, and they both will take a toll on the body. And your body's very smart, but it's also very dumb in the sense that your body just perceives I'm stressed. And that's enough. It doesn't particularly matter if it's actually life threatening or if it's, this like chronic bubbling BS that we deal with, or if it's overtraining or not moving enough. Your body is just going to register, oh my God, stress. And then stuff shuts down and stuff gets weird. So all of those I think are really great points to be made. And again, this could be an entirely separate episode.
Mm-hmm.
But let's segue into one of my favorites, if I may selfishly pull us this direction. The other one that we both talked about was food poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to be a whole separate topic altogether, but I do want to just mention that is another really, really common SIBO root cause that I see. There are, you know, the testing for it, for example, like the antivinculin antibodies, and the way it's talked about by the companies and the researchers who are doing the bulk of that research, they will talk about it under the umbrella of post-infectious IBS. Realistically, there's two variants within that world.
Mm-hmm.
There's the post-infectious IBS in the sense that somebody gets food poisoning, they are acutely unwell, and then they don't really recover from that, and it can take them a year or two to fully recover. But they do eventually recover on their own within the span of a year or two. So that's what I would personally call post-infectious IBS, truly. The stuff that it's the anti-CDTB antibodies, which we'll talk about in another episode. It's that reaction against the bacterial toxin and the damage from the bacterial toxin, and your body does eventually recover, and they spontaneously recover. I forget what the stat is, but it's like, 30% of the time or something, all on their own with absolutely no intervention. So that's what I would deem post-infectious IBS. And I realize I'm going against like the guy who does a lot of the research. The other
Yeah.
variant of it is the people who have a different presentation, where they get food poisoning, maybe they're acutely unwell for a period of time, maybe they have that like post-infectious IBS that resolves after a few months or a year or two, maybe they don't, but then somewhere down the road, usually a few months later, but sometimes it could be weeks, or a little bit longer, but somewhere down the road, those people then develop IBS. And what we've found is that those are the people with the antivinculin antibodies, the antibody against self tissue. And now that autoimmunity has caused SIBO. So that's the difference. I think that post-infectious IBS is probably more of an inflammatory state and a dysbiotic state than anything else. And it's that wave of dysbiosis
Yeah.
secondary to the food poisoning versus, I call this other variant of PIIBS, I call it autoimmune SIBO or autoimmune
Yeah.
dysmotility,
Yeah.
where now we have to do things to treat the SIBO, but we also need to do things to manage and pacify your immune system so that it chills the F out and stops attacking your nerves in your intestines, because
Yeah.
that's what's happening. And now we have kind of a different story and a different trajectory that we have in place. But that's where, the post-infectious IBS can turn into SIBO. It's usually it happens a little bit later because it takes a while for that autoimmunity to ramp up. And I have had some of those patients where we're talking and it's like, I make like a timeline in my notes whenever I'm going through a new patient chart and I'm asking them a gazillion questions and I'm trying to put them all in a timeline. And I'll observe, sometimes I'll be like, IBS was first popping up in like 2015. Then, 2014, you had food poisoning. Isn't that interesting? Let's talk about that more. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where I start opening the door for like that type of testing. I think that probably is a good enough place to leave it unless you have anything noteworthy to add to that. But I think this is a whole nother topic in and of itself, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that um, the antivinculin and the antibody, kind of like what you're saying, the autoimmune SIBO component, is almost a different animal in and of itself than just the typical dysbiosis that follows a food poisoning event.
Yeah.
I think that one thing too, and you can let me know on this, when it comes to the autoimmune response, I've heard that some of those antibody levels drop over time.
Hmm?
What's the time? Have you heard like specific timelines? Because I've heard it like all over the board. I'm just curious what your specific timeline typically
Is
is.
it like, are you saying with antivinculin specifically or autoimmunity more broadly?
Antivinculin specifically. So basically,
That
what
I
I've
don't
heard
know.
is that sometimes it dips over time. Like usually, the
Mm-hmm.
longer it's been since your food poisoning event, there's a dip in that antibody over time.
Yeah, I think potentially.
Okay.
What I would say is that and this is not necessarily from a research perspective, because honestly, they only started really figuring out the anti-vinculin autoimmunity and that kind of stuff in the last, I don't know, like 5 or 10 years. So we
Yeah.
don't have a tremendous amount of that research, I think. We're picking up steam now, and like Pimentel's group is doing a lot of this, but at least we don't have a lot of like longer term studies on anti-vinculin, and I think it's still picking up steam. Um, it There's a higher likelihood that the anti-vinculin antibodies will have dropped if you are doing things to pacify and appease the immune system.
Yeah, that's
So if during that time between your food poisoning event and the onset of this autoimmune dysmotility and the point where you get it diagnosed, for example, if you also discovered you were vitamin D deficient and then started taking vitamin D, or if you also started an exercise regimen, or if you also, started like eating more fiber and working on your gut microbiome, those are the kind of scenarios where it wouldn't surprise me if antivinculin starts to drop, because you start basically treating the inflammation and treating the autoimmunity, whether you realize it or not. But the scenarios where you haven't done those things, and maybe like in a really bad scenario, maybe somebody's like eating McDonald's 4 times a week
yeah.
and, like eating a standard American diet and not moving, not managing their stress. Like those are the scenarios where I would think that antivinculin would probably persist, just like any other autoimmunity.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I think that's again a really good point, and something that I've always believed in, that in the post-infectious, or I should say in your case, like the more autoimmunity type
yeah,
SIBO, that if the immune system's off, that is something that you can manipulate. So
totally.
there's a
I mean, through
lot
the
of different.
gut, if nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. You can manipulate the gut environment to potentially bring those levels down. Again, we don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of this. Like what you're saying,
Yeah,
the research is continuing to be done,
yeah.
but theoretically, like we've talked about before, just understanding how the body works, to me, that's something that's levers that we can pull on as practitioners too. Um, and I think it's a really important factor, because I do think sometimes when people think autoimmunity, they're like, geez, like that's a forever thing.
Yeah.
But I think
Well,
it's important just to know that you can pull on levers to manipulate the
yeah.
um, the environment and the immune system, so that the it can become it can become what's the word I'm
Well,
looking.
it can be your ally
Yeah,
again,
it can be
not
your ally
necessarily
again.
your enemy.
For sure. That's exactly how I would have put it. So thanks for
Yeah.
the help.
We're cosmic litter mates. We already
Yeah,
established that.
for sure.
I made you a brain. But yeah, I think, and I'll say, like, I don't want to speak for Dr. Pimentel, and I don't want to, like, say things that I shouldn't say, but I know that from a webinar, for example, he basically talked about some of their studies, and I believe this is still unpublished, but they have reason to believe, and they have shown that if you lower antivinculin antibodies in these individuals who have it, that uh, the IBS slash SIBO
Yeah.
goes away.
Yep.
So that, it's not practical for me to stick a needle in your vein, suck out all the antibodies, and spit them into the garbage.
What?
But I know if I could, I'd be rich. You kidding me?
Yeah.
But I think the more practical standpoint, and again, like borrowing from functional medicine in my field, is that if we could do things to get the immune system to chill out so it doesn't make antibodies against self tissue, and if we can work on that autoimmune process and that inflammation, then that will lower your antivinculin antibodies more than likely. And then that's the ticket to making sure that you don't relapse and continue to have SIBO. And admittedly, this is where like I'm a good clinician, but I'm a lousy researcher in a regard. Because honestly, I've seen so many of these cases and I've measured antivinculin on so many cases. I honest to God probably should be doing some sort of study and
Yeah.
using my data in that way. I haven't. And part of it is like, ideally, I think somebody like me, I would measure these antibodies, see it be positive once, and then every year I would be retesting these antibodies and checking in on people, or every 6 months I would be rechecking. I'm not doing that right now just because I've tried to be mindful of people's budgets, and I'm
Yeah.
always very sensitive about that. And the test, it's like a $200 test, so it's not an insignificant amount of money. But truthfully, if I was a better researcher and maybe a slightly less compassionate physician in that regard, I would just be telling everybody, all right, you had this positive once, let's remeasure in 6 months, and we're going to keep tracking the data points until it's negative. I wish I had that data to share, but I don't. But I do
Yeah.
think, with my experience lowering autoimmune antibodies in other conditions like Hashimoto's and
Yeah.
seeing those antibodies get better and symptoms resolve as the antibodies decrease, I do think that a lot of the same stuff that my colleagues and I talk about all day, every day, like vitamin D, turmeric, whatever it might be, I think that those strategies would still work for antivinculin because it's just another flavor of autoimmunity. You treat it the
Yeah,
same
for
way.
sure.
The
For
target
sure.
tissue is just different. And you know that it's going to probably lead to SIBO for you, so then you treat the SIBO if it's there.
Yeah, and I just again like to highlight the point that you can manipulate the immune system and
Yeah.
it isn't necessarily a forever thing. I just want to make sure people understand that because I do think a lot of times when I talk to people who have had food poisoning, there is like, and they know about antivinculin and they're like, oh man, I'm just like doomed with this thing because I
Yeah.
have this antivinculin. And that's not the case.
Yeah. I think that those are the people who you need to be mindful of certain things,
Yeah.
probably indefinitely, because autoimmunity, in truth, doesn't go away in the sense it doesn't get cured.
Yeah.
But remission is a very real thing, and remission is damn near as good.
For
So, yeah,
sure.
like, that doesn't mean that you take vitamin D for 2 years, you get the antivinculin to go away, and then all of a sudden you get to go walk around without vitamin D in your veins. Like, you still need to do the strategies, the stress management, getting enough sleep,
Yeah.
moving your body, getting vitamin D. Like, you still need to do those things and be mindful of that and not let your body get too inflamed because you know the target tissue that your immune system is going to go after if things get weird again. But I don't think that you need to be like doomed to have SIBO forever. I mean, I know that's not the case because I've treated enough of this to prove like that is not the case. You treat the
Yeah.
autoimmunity concurrently with the dysbiosis or SIBO or both, and these people will go into a remission state, and it's awesome. It's the next
Yeah.
best thing to an actual cure. So it is fabulous. But let's wrap up with some other SIBO cause. We don't have to go quite as in depth as we did on these handful that we talked about, but I think we covered the big biggies anyway, because these are the ones that are most common, certainly. But some other things that I think are associated with SIBO as a root cause could be adhesions. Like, I don't know if you've
Hmm.
had experience with this with your patients also, but,
Yeah.
I've had a couple of ladies I can remember clear as day, two of them. I saw them back to back, oddly enough. And both of them were like, I had my kid 25 years ago. I had a C-section, and then the IBS started up, and both of them were diagnosed with SIBO. And literally, the only thing that makes sense in the timing of it was C-section scars and adhesions.
Yeah.
And I referred both of them out to get visceral manipulation because I didn't do it at the time. And I've seen this where like I think C-sections, particularly older ones, where like the surgery might have been a little bit different or they might have opened you up a
Yeah.
little bit more, are potentially a cause. Appendectomies and gallbladder removals and other sort of surgeries, maybe I think it's maybe a little bit less problematic, but it can be a, a cause for adhesions for people. Endometriosis
Hmm.
too, like those chunks of endometrial tissue that can adhere to the bowel and disrupt motility, like that can be essentially like a scar tissue or an adhesion situation, or even something like Ehlers-Danlos, or like weird like connective tissue disorders that can cause funky ways that your body lays down connective tissue and fascia, and that could disrupt motility. So I think that adhesions is another big SIBO root cause. And then obviously part of the treatment for that would be to do some sort of physical mechanical work to break that up or release that if you can. Um,
Yeah. No, I've definitely seen, I mean, on top of my head, I can think of like three or four cases where visceral manipulation has been huge for these particular cases that I'm thinking of. In things like C-sections, I've seen be a factor. I do agree with the endometriosis aspect too, potentially being adhesive or have adhesions. I think the endometriosis is really interesting too. There was a study on how, because I think that honestly some of the microbial dysbiosis can lead to more endometriosis flares. I mean, it's an issue with inflammation most of the time. So I think in general, endometriosis and SIBO are very highly linked. And in certain studies, things like antibiotics, which again isn't necessarily the method that I would use for this, but antibiotics have been shown to decrease lesion size in endometriosis patients, which is super fascinating. But it's kind of one of those situations where I do think like the visceral manipulation plays a really big role in decreasing some of the symptoms, but you still want to make sure you're addressing the gut aspect, because it could be leading to more adhesions. But I think that's with adhesions in general. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think adhesions in general, and you know, they're like with endometriosis as an example, there are things that you can't get rid of. So like we can't go back in time to 1982 and prevent you from having a C-section.
Yeah, exactly.
But what we can do is we can try to mobilize that tissue and keep it pliable and keep it moving so that stuff doesn't adhere. And similarly, like endometriosis, you're not going to get rid of those endometrial lesions, those chunks of tissue that are just hanging out in the bowel or in the abdominal cavity. But if you could shrink the size of them and make them so that they're less inflammatory and less like active, if you will, that's where like maybe working on hormones in conjunction with the SIBO stuff is like working on your inflammation, working on estrogen dominance, if that's a thing for you, that's not uncommon with that group, like making sure that those endometrial lesions are not big and inflamed and ticked off 24/7. That will be part of the healing process. And then by all means, have somebody move your innards around and like do visceral manipulation and try to work on that front as well. But I do think that making sure that the physical state of the tissue is such that things can move and things can do what they're supposed to do. And they're not all like adhered and wonky in weird ways.
Yeah.
So I think that's there. I don't think it's, you know, I don't think that having a C-section dooms you to having SIBO. And I don't think, you know, appendectomy or gallbladder removal, I don't think those doom you. But I do think it can be a root cause for certain people. Yeah. And it's worth parsing out. I've also, now this should not be a surprise, but I'll make mention of it. Gastric bypasses are an area of interest of mine that I occasionally read up on a little bit because my mom had an open Roux-en-Y in 2008. And that is a group of people also, the post-gastric bypass or bariatric surgery group that has a startlingly high rate of SIBO. And, you know, with the Roux-en-Y, for example, they literally chop out the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. They chop it out and they bypass it entirely. And they're changing the size of the stomach. And in my mom's case, she had her gallbladder removed at the same time. And that, you know, you want to talk about a major abdominal surgery. The gastric bypass, particularly the Roux-en-Y, is huge. And I don't know if SIBO is so highly associated with that group because of the scar tissue, or because they changed the size and the digestive capacity of the stomach, or because they bypass the duodenum, which is huge.
Yeah.
And like, that's where like the MMC waves, which we'll talk about in future podcast episodes, like 70% of them start in the stomach and then progress through the intestines, through the duodenum. And then the rest of them pretty much, I think the other 30% begin in the duodenum. And it's bananas that they just chop that out and bypass it altogether. And then they leave it dangling there, flapping in the wind. And so I don't know, these people also tend to have a lot of nutritional deficiencies because of the malabsorptive procedure. So I don't know what, quadfecta situations happens, but that's another abdominal surgery that, whether it be from adhesions, the malabsorption, the size of the stomach, the digestive capacity, whatever it is, those people have a lot of SIBO across the board. So that's
Yeah.
another area where this could overlap with the current conversation.
Yeah. No, I think that stomach surgeries in general are fascinating to me. I know there's actually a surgery, or at least there was, where they like clip the vagus nerve. Are you
Mm-hmm.
familiar with
Yeah,
that?
vagotomy. Yeah.
That just blows my mind. But um but no, you're totally right. I think that like I I'd imagine the issues with gastric surgeries just from a digestive stomach, just from
Yeah.
a stomach acid standpoint, not even the
Yeah, if nothing else.
yeah, it's wild.
Yeah.
I will say another sort of root causal factor that I have been really heavily keeping my eye on, and I've been doing a lot of work with, is like liver bile flow issues.
Mm.
Um, I mean, there's definitely links with in the research with liver, like more liver disease, so severe liver issues in SIBO.
Mm.
But I do tend to think like, I mean, a lot of people with SIBO, if they're having like die-off reactions, like that's always like a bing, 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 like a red flag for me when they come to see me and they're like, man, I just like haven't been able to tolerate herbals. Maybe their liver enzymes are a little elevated in their
Mm-hmm.
labs. Sometimes their bilirubin's a little bit elevated, which can
Mm-hmm.
sometimes be associated with poor bile flow.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's an issue, especially in methane cases,
Mm.
just because bile tends to help with constipation, bile
Mm.
flow. It helps to
Yeah.
stimulate motility. It
Mm-hmm.
also tends to feed hydrogen sulfide
Mm.
bacteria, so it can balance. It can basically compete with your methane producers.
Mm.
But I do think that bile in general can be antimicrobial as well. It helps
Yeah.
control the pH in the environment in the small intestines. So if you don't have that mechanism running really efficiently, I've seen that be huge for certain people. And I don't really think it's talked about much in the SIBO
Mm-hmm.
space,
Yeah.
but I will say I've seen a lot of people respond really well. One case in particular that I'm thinking of was a woman who was maybe about 35, had been working on SIBO for a while, but she had real like severe pains that would creep up.
Mm-hmm.
And she kept getting her gallbladder looked at, and she was basically diagnosed. I forget what the phrase is, but it's basically like they think there's a gallbladder issue, but there's no mechanism that they can see.
Gallbladder sludge? Did they see sludge on the ultrasound?
No, I don't think they saw
No.
anything.
Okay.
But gallbladder sludge, again, to me, would be an indicator that bile flow is not great.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think bile, in her case, we really worked on the liver. We worked on getting bile flowing optimally, and she stopped having these really severe attacks. But just from what I've seen, again, working with people, I just think it's a really big area. The liver also takes a huge, has a huge burden when there's gut issues in general.
Yeah.
So I find that the liver is often very depleted in SIBO, just from
Mm-hmm.
maybe years of dealing with excess toxins.
Yeah.
And the liver is producing the bile and sending it to the gallbladder, and then the gallbladder spits it out into the small intestines. But if your liver
Mm-hmm.
isn't healthy, you're going to have poor bile production. And then you really want the gallbladder to be able to deliver the bile. And then if you've had your gallbladder removed, that kind of creates other issues. But you could still
Yeah.
have poor bile flow in that case from the
Mm-hmm.
liver not producing it if you had your gallbladder removed.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if that's something you tend to see often, but it is like one that more